want to tell you a story, a variant of Don't Put Your Hand on the Hot Stove, my own version, something I actually went through. When I was much younger, I had left a metal spoon in a pan that was sitting above a fire, gas lit, so actual fire. I didn't think much of it. I waited about 10 minutes, touched the spoon, and it hurt like hell. I didn't think. I think I was 8 or 9. I was just thinking, oh, yeah, the heat, the fire, it's a metal spoon. It all makes sense now. I learned a lesson. Some years later, I was on a trip with my parents, and I was out in the middle of the ocean trying to swim against the current. Now, I had read about currents, or heard about it, but feeling that current and how it was being swept away from the boat onto the open ocean, and me requiring the active participation of one of the more skilled gentlemen swimmers on board to bring me back in. Well, that was also a lesson of when you're out in the middle of the ocean, you should be aware of these things, or maybe you should be a better swimmer in general. These are the lessons we learn through life. There are many, many such lessons, probably uncountable. And generally speaking, when we learn these lessons, we develop a heuristic of how to go about things so as to minimize the negative outcomes that we inevitably will encounter in life, because life is filled with this. That's what life is about. It's about being born, going through a bunch of shit, and then dropping dead. And the one meme that has been circulating around since time immemorial in internet terms, this meme of who hurt you, is one of the funnier memes. It's meant to be a kind of knockdown argument against the ideas and sometimes outright proclamations made by the manosphere, and typically coming from females, but not exclusively, is who hurt you? You're upset, you're angry, or you have X view. The reason why you have this view is who hurt you. That's not really much of a reason. And if we were to try to map on that to other experiences, it's not necessarily a completely irrelevant question. So the idea that men who've had lots of experiences with women in their lives and have been through a lot of shit have never been hurt, that's silly. We've all been, quote-unquote, hurt in some capacity. The real question here is whether or not the hurt, which tends to be temporary, is the driving force and factor in the development of views that ensue post-relationship, or post-woman in many cases. And I would argue in the majority cases, it's not. Why? Typically, that question is asked when women encounter red pill rage, that immediate reaction to the sense of emotional betrayal men feel. And sometimes red pill rage goes on for a very long time indeed. But typically, that tends to simmer down, and men become more reasonable when they get older, etc., etc. They have more experience. And so the question of who hurt you doesn't answer anything. It is a question, after all. It doesn't really explain anything. Explanatory power is everything, and it has absolutely no explanatory power. It's just a question. It's kind of relevant. Obviously, there's a path. You know, the reason why you don't leave metal spoons and pans cooking over a fire is because you'll hurt yourself. It's really hot. You learn that lesson, amongst many others. And this is what that question seems to miss. Sure, there was some initial hurt at some point in time, but is that initial hurt the most salient factor here? Is that initial hurt the most relevant thing to ask? A better question to ask here would be simply, why do you have these views? What happened in general, not who hurt you? The typical female wishy-washy emotional question, who hurt you? And sometimes men do it too. As most of you know, I'm so far afield from interacting with females that I simply don't have access to those types of emotions anymore. I'm pretty dead emotionally, I would say, overall. But specifically, trying to think back on specific episodes and the attempt to invoke feelings, as I've mentioned in earlier videos, that video on freedom, that really were feelings of the moment, never to be relived again because of the peculiarities and particularities of that moment. Yeah, so I don't know anything about hurt. I know that in the distant past, a series of, you could say, cascading events, some of which involved hurt, and some of which involved, you could say, failure or damage, led eventually to a series of thoughts and analyses, many of which are to be found in my videos, of which there are these days over 800. And yeah, so who hurt you? Sure, but that doesn't really capture the essence of what's going on. Generally speaking, that's the heuristic people go by. They go through experiences and they learn things. And they try to integrate those experiences into the learning so as to avoid the harms that may come if they decide to participate or engage in the activity again. And in a sense, the question, who hurt you, is not terribly relevant. It's what happens afterwards, oftentimes years down the line, not in the immediate reaction to those things, as is embodied by red pill rage, which is a common thing. I don't deny that. Now, one way of looking at this, if you're more conventional, is say, well, you learn from your mistakes, sure, who hurt you, whatever. In the future, when you're looking for a female partner, you go about it in a different way. You're wiser. You're more savvy. You are more conscious of the things you're looking for and the things to avoid. Well, that's true. But trying to link this to my previous video, there's also the option of just not bothering if you don't think the juice is worth the squeeze, which is a completely reasonable calculation to make. Yes, you can say, well, I'm going to avoid this and that and what have you in females and looking for a partner or a girlfriend or a wife. And now I know what to avoid because I was hurt a long time ago and I've analyzed the situation. I've done the quote-unquote cost-benefit analysis here. That's one option. The other option is just to give it up. I'm not saying one should do either necessarily. That's down to each individual man to make that choice, not my decision. But both decisions are valid because really, if you think about it, the other option, the former option, that's the best you can come up with. You need to be savvier and more intelligent about the choices you're making when it comes to partners. You need to think more about this, about what you want and what works for you and blah, 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 blah. That's the best they can come up with. None of it makes sense. It's not as if, and this is the point I'm trying to make, that question is a serious question. They're not trying to ascertain the reasons why you, a man, would, say, choose not to pursue relationships or be very, very skeptical of women in general and what they want and what they claim they want. So I think this question is an inauthentic question to begin with, because the person who typically asks that question is not really looking for an answer. It's a proclamation rather than a question, even though it comes in the form of a question. And it simply doesn't take into account the normal, natural heuristic of most thinking human beings of when you make mistakes, you try to learn from them. And the best you can come up with in this scenario is to learn from the mistakes of your dating past. So date smarter, so to speak, right? And the other option that no man has ever told is an option is to just leave it all behind. As I said, there is a life after women. You can do it. And it imposes very little cost or penalty on you. Quite the opposite. But there's a bigger picture here, a bigger picture at stake. And I think it's also encapsulated in this notion of who hurt you, this pseudo-question, we'll call it that henceforth. And that is, men have been lied to. There is this veil of lies and you could say good intentions put forth under the guise of timeless wisdom that is incredibly confusing to men. It is a form of disinformation in the sense that they are not getting the actual real information they need in order to make decisions, whether it comes to dating or related topics. And so it's not so much about hurt, but a general sense of betrayal. Now, human beings are really, really bad at coming to terms with the reality they live in. And I've talked about this in conjunction with Wojak and separately. For example, the fact that being attractive is probably, and almost certainly I should put, the most salient factor in anything you do, especially the dating market. The best thing you could do is to become as attractive as possible. And then the other qualities might count. And it's also important for getting jobs. You earn more if you're more attractive. And getting a social circle. And take your pick. Do people tell you that in life growing up? They certainly didn't tell me that. I didn't know anything about this. I thought, personality counts. I mean, women and their self-reporting is, of course, the most unreliable thing out there. You have to look at the science. You have to see what they do. By their deeds you shall know them, as I like to quote from the Bible. And that's less to do with hurt, more to do with a sense of betrayal, a profound degree of dishonesty that permeates the culture in our society, of people just not being square with reality and the people they interact with, even though there's this sort of tacit understanding that, yes, this is the case. Most people would acknowledge, for example, that if you really press them, that looks matter a lot. They might not, in their responses, reflect the actual data that they matter the most, say they're really important, but they wouldn't say they're the most important maybe, but they would acknowledge this. It's a little game we all play. We all play pretend, right? We pretend that certain things are important when they're actually not. So there's a sort of metaphysical layer to this, the metaphysical layer of personality traits and being humorous and what have you. But the reality is if you look good and you're sufficiently tall, barring some other limiting factors, and they do exist, like social awkwardness and autism, you're pretty well off. That's what you need to get the engine running on these so-called romantic matters. And as I just mentioned, a host of other things. It's not just that, obviously. But the real issue at stake here is that people don't come clean about this. There's no public discourse about that. And I suppose it has to do with people's fears. Imagine if you learned about evolutionary psychology and biology in high school or something, and they said, yeah, well, here's the deal. Your looks matter more than anything else, and that's it. Case closed. You might want to adduce some graphs and data sets, have publications read as homework, discussions, whatever, sure. But you would still reach that conclusion. People like optimism. They like a sunny, bright picture, even when the world is anything but. And essentially, it's a type of snake oil salesmanship. They want you to be that choo-choo train that keeps on choo-chooing forward on the tracks, despite the fact that it might be more sensible not to do that in your specific case. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, because of probabilities and realities. No one is ever going to level with you on that, not in the public sphere. And I think that's the much more salient factor here. This whole pseudo question of who hurt you, it really comes down to that. This betrayal, apart from the general heuristic that we all try to learn from our mistakes. These people aren't interested in honest conversation. And they're not interested in making these truths publicly known. Now, personally, I think the veil of lies and deception is simply not worth it. I think that it's just worth coming clean with people. It all is revolving around the same idea of purposely filtering out the truth and purposefully deceiving people so as to keep the choo-choo trains chugging. That's what they want. They want people to keep chugging no matter what the obstacles are, irrespective of how likely it is they will succeed or not. You can call it hope. I think in my video on Pandora's box, or the metaphor of Pandora's box, somebody left a comment. Hope was the worst thing to be let out of Pandora's box, and I think it is. As I like to famously quote Raceland Magier, hope is the carrot dangled before the draft horse in a vain attempt to keep him prodding along. We need to move forward with our eyes open. That doesn't mean giving up, but it means circumventing these silly pseudo questions like who hurt you and being honest with ourselves. But the honesty part with ourselves is that much more difficult when you have an entire public infrastructure dedicated to lying to you. And then you have to spend years, in some cases decades, deconstructing that and trying to understand how the world actually is, as opposed to the claims being made of how it's purported to be. And that is a hell of a lot of work. It is painful and hurtful, and it's damn fucking time consuming. And wouldn't it be a hell of a lot better if we just learned this stuff a lot earlier on, and we already had this model in place so as to proceed in a much better and more efficient way in our lives, knowing what reality is instead of being lied to, and knowing how people are, both men and women, and the world at large. That's not going to happen, mind you, but that is what should happen, because it would prevent so much bullshit. It would prevent these pointless interactions around, who hurt you? You're a loser, you can't get all this stuff. It would just be acknowledged that there's a common reality. And some people are given a really shitty deck of cards, and some people are given an amazing deck of cards, and you get every variation in between. My friend Adam Jensen, who killed himself over 2 years ago, was exceptionally intelligent, and very attractive, and tall, and athletic. But he was also an alcoholic, and very, very depressive. There's a variation, a deadly combination for you. And in many ways, he was a victim of not being told the truth his whole life, whether it came to religious fictions or the fictions of so-called female affection. Wouldn't it be helpful if we were all honest to ourselves and to the world, and the world were honest to us? That's really what this is about. And to my view, this is what MGTOW has always been about, trying to be as honest as possible. It doesn't always make you happy. In fact, it rarely does. But it's a lot easier to navigate the world, I think, when you're not working in the context of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are great for the moment, maybe if you're a very young child, but at some point in time, reality is going to kick in. You're going to have to look for that job. You're going to have to pay your bills. You're going to have to do all the shit that adults have to do that we don't enjoy, whatever. But the one fairy tale they never drop is the fairy tale of love and how kind people are, and especially women, sugar and spice and all things nice. And if you just try hard and work hard enough, and if you're a nice person, people will appreciate that, and blah, 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 right? Instead, how about this? Looks are the most important thing you can have. Some people have them, some people don't. There's a lot of variation in between. Make the best of your looks, and you can work on other things, but that would be the most important thing, and move on. That would be much more helpful than the gibberish that people are fed. So getting back to the original pseudo question, who hurt you? The pseudo question doesn't even break down the most rudimentary details of what's going on here and the degree of deception that's being exercised in the public to prevent people from coming to terms with a reality that is obviously sitting in front of them. Many of these people know it is because they're experiencing it on a day-to-day basis. And yes, they feel betrayed because they've been lied to. And sometimes they've had to lie to themselves about this. And if people aren't willing to get that, well, fair enough. But don't expect people to be sympathetic, necessarily, to the other view when it's a lie, when it's not true. Or for them to really want to make nicey nice with people that are not willing to entertain certain realities. In any event, as always, if I'm still alive, I will likely check you out later. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye, and have a good week. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.